In this video, we'll be looking at Lazarus and Folkman's transactional model of stress and coping in the context of looking at the cognitive changes that occur when a person encounters stress. So Lazarus and Folkman proposed that stress involves an encounter or a transaction between an individual and external environment. A stress response depends on the individual's interpretation of the stressor and their ability to cope with it. So this model really focuses on how a person interprets a particular stressor in order for them to either experience a stress response or not. And this is largely determined on their perceived ability to cope with the stressor that they encounter. Some key concepts that we need to look at in order to understand this model is appraisal. The first one we're looking at is appraisal. And appraisal is defined as an individual's interpretation of the stressor and their ability to cope with it. So although it might be the same stressor, if different people have different appraisals to the same stressor, then they might have different stress responses. For example, when you're going into a test at school, that test might be the same stressor, so it's the same stimulus for every person, but people might have different appraisals. So for someone who has not studied, they might have a very different appraisal, so their interpretation of how they might be able to cope with it might be very different to someone who has worked very hard and made sure that they have studied and are ready. Therefore, these two people will have different stress responses. So Lazarus and Folkman say that when there is an imbalance between a person's appraisal, so their interpretation of the stressor, and the demands of their situation and the estimation of their ability to meet those demands, then they will experience a stress response. Sorry, there's a typo there. So if a person doesn't think that they've got the ability to cope with that stressor, then they will experience a stress response. Appraisal, however, is not necessarily a conscious process. It is subjective and it is highly personal, and it depends on our estimation of our ability to cope with a certain stressor, and it happens automatically. It doesn't necessarily involve a person sitting there and consciously thinking through these different appraisals that we're going to go through, but it takes into account previous experience that we've had and our perceived ability to cope with this stressor. There are two different types of appraisals that we'll be looking at, and you can find further information on these on page 522 of your textbooks. The ones we'll be looking at are primary and secondary appraisal. And in secondary appraisal, there is something also called reappraisal. So in primary appraisal, we evaluate or judge the significance of the situation. So when you encounter a stressor, your primary appraisal would involve answering questions such as, am I in trouble? Is there something I have to deal with? The outcomes of this primary appraisal might be irrelevant, benign positive, or stressful. So if it is irrelevant, then obviously you're not going to worry about it. If it is benign and positive, then again, that probably won't lead to a stressful situation. However, if you appraise it as stressful, then we can then engage in additional appraisals. So those additional appraisals can come in three forms, either harm loss, threat, or challenge. So if that added appraisal is harm loss, then you'll be thinking of what is lost already. If it is a threat, then we'll be looking at what harm or loss might occur in the future. And if it's a challenge, then you'll be looking at the assessment of potential growth from the situation. We'll be taking a look at these examples in further detail in class. Secondary appraisal is when we evaluate our coping options and resources and our options for then dealing with that stressful situation once you have already appraised it as a stressful situation. So these coping options and resources might be internal, so for example, your own personal strength and determination and motivation, or it might be external. For example, in some situations, in order to get through the stressful situation, you might need things like money or support from family or peers, or help from teachers and other staff. Reappraisal is when you are then reconsidering which additional resources you need to cope with the situation. So reappraising the situation while taking account of the coping resources that are available. So This is where you're taking in more information about what could be potentially available. And once you've taken in those factors, then you're reappraising the coping resources that you have in order to reappraise that threat to actually see, well, actually, this initial stressor that I have labeled as a stress, is it actually that stressful now that I have taken into account all these different coping mechanisms? For example, again, with the test example at school, when you reappraise, you might be taking into consideration resources such as help from teachers, YouTube videos that you can relook at, past exams, and then reassessing how much time you have and how stressful that situation is or is likely to be. The model also really focuses on this idea of coping. So when we can't escape a stress response, which is really highlighted in that idea of the fight, flight, and the HPA axis, then we need to learn how to effectively cope with it. For some stresses, the appraisal that we give to it can either make it an acute stressor or a chronic stress. For example, VCE has the potential to be a chronic stress, but when you can't escape that response because you've chosen to do VCE, then you have to learn how to effectively cope with it. Coping here is defined as the process of constantly changing cognitive and behavioral efforts to manage specific internal and/or external stresses that are appraised as taxing or exceeding the resources of a person. Now, that is definitely very wordy, so I want you to have a go at rephrasing that in your own words, making sure that you keep the key elements of that definition in there. In class, we'll be looking at two different types of coping. We'll be looking at problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping, as well as looking at how we can apply this Lazarus and Folkman model to specific examples so you've got tangible examples ready to better understand and consolidate your understanding of this model.